The Silver Moon Pack used to call Rosalie Ezra their star. As the beta's daughter, she was the strategist, the one who turned slaughter into victory. She was the shield who bled, so the pups could sleep. She had spent a decade mapping every inch of these woods. Her tactical empathy a gift she used to keep her people alive. She was the architect of their peace, a woman who wore duty like a crown and perfection like armor. Now, that armor was gone, and the crown was a circle of cold, wet mud. The Hollow, a place reserved for the Pack's most reviled criminals, was thick with the smell of rotted wood and impending death. Rosalie stood chained to the center post, her beta uniform shredded to rags. Her own soldiers, men she had trained and fed, stood in the driving rain with faces like stone. "Strip her rank!" Alpha Fenris's voice cut through the downpour, slick with the venom of a rejected man. "Break her wolf!" In that moment, Rosalie felt a soul-deep severance. Her wolf, the fierce companion of her bloodline, let out a final, agonizing whimper before being smothered by an unnatural silence. Then came the brand. The unranked mark hissed against her shoulder, the scent of her burning skin a jagged period at the end of her life of service. She was a ghost in a tattered shift, waiting for the executioner to finish the job. The massive man stepped forward, the silver-edged blade catching the first gray light of a dawn she wasn't meant to see. Rosalie's knees buckled. She looked at the faces of her pack, searching for just one spark of the loyalty she had given them. She found only the cold hunger of a mob. The blade began its descent. And then the world was torn in half. A roar of pure, cataclysmic power vaporized the heavy wooden gates. A freezing fog, thick with the scent of ozone and ancient cedar, swept into the clearing. Out of the mist stepped a figure of nightmare and legend, King Soren. The Bonebreaker. He didn't walk. He stalked, every step leaving a footprint of frost in the gray slush. His molten gold eyes ignored the alpha on the dais, locking onto Rosalie with a predatory intensity that made the mate bond, the very thing the silver was meant to kill, snap into place with the force of a lightning strike. Soren's voice didn't just fill the clearing. It vibrated, in the marrow of their bones. "Touch my mate," the King of the North growled, his aura dropping every silver moonwolf to their knees. "And I will bury this pack in their own blood." You're listening to The Fall of a Legend and the Arrival of a Monster, a full-length shifter romance audiobook, written by Grace Cruz. Please subscribe to this channel to join our community of romance lovers. And now, the real story begins. Chapter 1. The Shield and the Shadow. The rogue scent hit Rosalie like a punch to the gut, sour, rotting, and dangerously close to the border. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for those who didn't have a pack to protect. As the beta's daughter, Rosalie Ezra was the glue holding the Silver Moon Pack together, and today the glue was thick with the scent of war. "Shift to a diamond formation!" Rosalie shouted, her voice cutting through the humid forest air. Her guards moved instantly. They didn't ask questions because Rosalie was never wrong. She watched the tree line with eyes that saw more than just wood and leaf. She saw the geometry of a battlefield. In her mind, she could feel the legacy of her father pressing down on her shoulders. He had been the greatest beta in their history. Since his heart gave out, she had worked twice as hard to fill his boots. She believed that if she was perfect, the pack was safe. If she failed, it was all on her. It was a heavy weight, a martyr's crown she wore every single day. "Rosalie, they're circling!" a scout yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let them," Rosalie muttered, her hand gripping the hilt of her silver-etched dagger. "They're baiting us into the ravine. We go high, now!" She led the charge, her boots pounding against the damp earth. The forest was alive with the sound of snapping twigs and the low, guttural growls of the rogues. It was a dance she knew by heart. She directed the defenders like a conductor, closing gaps before the enemy could find them. When the skirmish ended, Not a single silver moon wolf was lost. "Clean your blades," Rosalie ordered, wiping sweat from her brow. "We head back. The Alpha expects a report." As the tension of the fight ebbed away, a new, oilier kind of dread took its place. She felt a presence behind her, a heavy, dominating scent of cedar and old blood. Alpha Fenris. He was leaning against a thick oak, clapping his hands slowly. The sound was like a series of small gunshots. "Magnificent, Rosalie," Fenris said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. He walked closer, stepping into her personal space until she could feel the heat of his chest. "You handle a blade almost as well as you handle a room. You're a rare jewel in this pack." "I'm just doing my job, Alpha," Rosalie replied, her voice flat. She tried to step back, but his hand shot out, gripping her chin. His thumb traced her lower lip, his touch possessing and cold. "A job is for servants. A jewel. A jewel belongs in a vault. My vault. You've spent long enough in the dirt, Rosalie. It's time you realized where you truly belong." His praise didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a trap springing shut around her ankles. Chapter 2. The Gilded Insult. The spring gala was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles, but to Rosalie, it felt like a funeral. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, her beta's uniform pressed and perfect. Her heart was a drum in her chest, beating out a warning she couldn't ignore. Every time she looked up, she found Fenris watching her from his throne, a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The music stopped abruptly. Fenris stood, his cloak billowing behind him like a dark cloud. He held up a golden goblet, his gaze locking onto Rosalie. "Members of the Silver Moon," Fenris's voice boomed, echoing off the marble walls. "We have flourished under my rule, but an alpha needs a mate to truly lead. Someone with blood as pure as our laws." Rosalie felt the blood drain from her face. The elders leaned forward, their faces etched with curiosity. She wanted to run, to hide in the woods where things made sense, but her feet were frozen to the floor. "Rosalie Ezra," Fenris called out, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous purr. "You have served this pack well. Tonight I offer you the highest honor. Step forward and take your place as my high consort." The room went silent. 100 eyes turned toward her. This wasn't a proposal, it was a public claim. If she accepted, she would be his property forever. If she refused, she was insulting the man who controlled her very life. Rosalie took a breath, the scent of expensive perfume and sweat filling her lungs. She walked forward, each step feeling like she was walking toward a cliff. She stopped 5 feet from him and bowed, but she didn't kneel. "Alpha," she said, her voice clear and echoing. "I am honored by the offer, truly. But my heart belongs to the pack's defense, not to a throne. I must respectfully decline. I am a soldier, not a consort." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Fenris's face didn't move, but his eyes turned a shade of gold that promised pain. The air in the room grew heavy, the pressure of his alpha aura making it hard for the guests to breathe. "You reject me?" Fenris whispered, the words barely audible. "In front of my people?" "I choose my duty, Alpha," Rosalie countered, her chin held high despite the trembling in her knees. Fenris stepped down from the dais, leaning in close until his breath hissed against her ear. The scent of cedar was now choked with the smell of scorched earth. "You've made a mistake, Rosalie," he hissed, his voice a venomous snake. "You think you're so high and mighty because of your father's name? You'll learn that without me, you are nothing. You'll be begging for this mercy before the week is out." He turned and walked away, leaving Rosalie standing alone in the center of the room, the silence of the crowd feeling like a death sentence. Chapter 3. The Midnight Treason. Rosalie was dreaming of her father when the door to her quarters was kicked open. The sound shattered the silence of the night, sending her heart into her throat. She scrambled for the dagger under her pillow, but 3 heavy shadows were already on her. "Rosalie Ezra, you are under arrest for high treason," a voice shouted. It was Silas, one of her own lieutenants, the man she had trained herself. "Silas, what is this?" Rosalie gasped, her arms pinned behind her back. "I haven't done anything." "Save it for the Alpha," Silas said, his eyes full of a strange, bitter hate. "We found the letters, Rosalie. We know you've been selling us out to the north." They dragged her out of bed, not even letting her put on shoes. The cold stone of the hallway bit into her feet as they marched her toward her father's old study. The door was ajar, and inside, the room was a wreck. Books were torn from shelves, and drawers were smashed onto the floor. Fenris was standing by the desk, holding a stack of yellowed parchment. He looked up as they shoved her into the room, his expression one of mock disappointment. "I wanted to believe in you, Rosalie," Fenris said, tossing a letter onto the desk. It bore the seal of the Northern King, a crown of frost. "But the evidence is undeniable. These letters detail our border patrols, our food stores, even my own personal habits." "That's impossible!" Rosalie screamed, struggling against the guards. "I've never even seen those. I spent my whole life protecting this border. Why would I give it away?" "Maybe because the North offered you what I couldn't," Fenris mused, walking toward her. "Or maybe you're just as rotten as the rogues you claim to fight." "Look at the dates, Fenris," Rosalie pleaded, her voice cracking. "I was at the southern outpost when that letter was allegedly written. It's a tactical impossibility. I couldn't have sent it." "The pact doesn't care about your tactics anymore, Rosalie," Fenris said, leaning down to look her in the eye. He looked happy. He looked like he was winning a game he had started long ago. "They only care about the traitor in their midst." He turned to the guards, his voice turning cold and final. "Strip her of her rank. Take her to the cells. She dies at dawn." Rosalie felt a cold weight settle in her chest, a physical thing that made it hard to move. She looked at the guards, her friends, her family. They all looked away. The betrayal was a physical pain, sharper than any blade. "You did this," she whispered, staring at Fenris. "You framed me because I said no." Fenris just smiled, a cold, satisfied curve of the lips. "I told you, Rosalie. Without me, you are nothing." As they dragged her toward the dark, damp stairs of the dungeon, she could see the first hints of gray light in the sky. Her time was running out. She was the shield of the pack, but the pack had decided to break her. Chapter 4. The Breaking of the Wolf. The hollow was a place where hope went to die. It was a muddy clearing at the very edge of the territory, surrounded by ancient, gnarled trees that seemed to lean in to watch the carnage. A cold rain was falling, turning the ground into a gray soup that clung to Rosalie's bare feet. She was chained to a heavy stone post in the center of the clearing. Her beta uniform had been torn away, replaced by a thin, tattered shift that offered no protection against the wind. Her pack, her family, stood in a circle around the clearing, their faces cold and unmoving. "Rosalie Ezra," Fenris announced, stepping forward. He held a long silver needle that shimmered with a sickly blue light. "For the crime of treason, you are hereby stripped of your wolf. You will die as a human, unranked and forgotten." "No!" Rosalie cried out, her voice raw. "Fenris, please don't do this." The silver injection was a nightmare made real. As the needle pierced her neck, Rosalie felt a liquid fire pour into her veins. It wasn't just physical pain. It was a spiritual execution. She felt her wolf, the fierce, loyal spirit that had been with her since birth, scream in agony. The bond was being cauterized. She felt the connection to the moon, to the forest, to life itself being ripped away. Her internal world went silent. The unranked brand was pressed into her shoulder, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. She slumped against the chains, a hollow shell of the woman she had been 10 minutes ago. "The executioner will proceed," Fenris said, his voice devoid of any mercy. The executioner stepped forward, a massive man with a hooded face. He raised a heavy, silver-edged blade. The metal caught the first rays of the rising sun, flashing with a deadly light. Rosalie closed her eyes, waiting for the end. She had nothing left. Her wolf was gone. Her pack was gone. "Do it!" Fenris commanded. The blade began its descent, and then the world exploded. Chapter 5. The King's Claim. A sound like a mountain cracking in half ripped through the clearing. It wasn't a howl, it was a roar of pure, unadulterated power. The heavy wooden gates of the hollow didn't just open, they were vaporized into splinters. A thick, unnatural fog rolled into the clearing, smelling of ozone and ancient ice. Out of the mist stepped a figure that made even Fenris's guards stumble back in terror. It was King Soren, the bone-breaker Vane. He was a giant of a man, clad in black furs and scarred armor. His eyes were a burning, molten gold that seemed to pierce the very fog. He didn't walk. He stalked. Every step he took left a footprint of frost on the muddy ground. "Touch my mate." Soren's voice vibrated through the air, a dread howl that physically dropped the Silver Moon wolves to their knees. "And I will bury this pack in their own blood." Rosalie squinted through the haze, her heart stuttering. Mate? The word hit her like a physical blow. The mate bond, something she thought was dead with her wolf, suddenly snapped into place with a violent electric force. It was a golden thread pulling her toward the monster in the mist. Soren ignored the growling guards and walked straight to the executioner. With one hand, he gripped the man's throat and tossed him 20 feet like a discarded rag. He turned to Rosalie, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they were locked on her with a predatory intensity that made her breath hitch. "Soren!" Fenris barked, trying to find his voice through the paralyzing fear. "This is Silver Moonland. She is a traitor. You have no right." Soren turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on Fenris with the weight of a falling star. "I have every right. She is mine. By blood, by bone, and by the ancient laws you pretend to follow." He reached out and snapped Rosalie's chains with a single, effortless jerk. As the metal fell away, he caught her before she could hit the mud. His touch was like ice and fire, a shock to her system that made her suppressed wolf stir in the dark corners of her mind. Rosalie looked up at him, her vision blurring. She saw the scars on his face, the lethal authority in his eyes. But she also saw something else. He wasn't looking at Fenris with rage. He was looking at him with a cold, triumphant satisfaction. "You're late," Rosalie whispered, the words barely a breath. Soren leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "I arrived exactly when I needed to, Rosalie. Now, we go home." He marked her then, his teeth sinking into the tender skin of her neck. It wasn't a gentle claim. It was a conquest. The mark burned like a brand, sealing her fate to the King of the North. Chapter 6. The Gilded Cage. The transition from the muddy hollow to the back of a massive warhorse was a blur of motion and pain. Soren didn't speak as they crossed the border into the Northern Territories. He held Rosalie against his chest, his arms like iron bands. She could feel the steady thrum of his heart, a rhythmic reminder that she was still alive, and that she was no longer free. As they crossed the final ridge, the obsidian citadel came into view. It was a terrifying masterpiece of stone and ice, carved directly into the heart of a frozen mountain. It loomed over the landscape like a silent guardian, its dark spires reaching for the gray sky. "This is your new home," Soren said, his voice a low rumble against her back. They rode through the massive iron gates where rows of northern warriors stood at attention. They didn't cheer. They watched Rosalie with eyes full of suspicion and sharp, cold judgment. To them, she wasn't a queen. She was a southern trophy. Soren dismounted and carried her into the great hall. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine and roasting meat, but it felt cold to Rosalie. He set her down on a fur-lined chair near a massive hearth. "The healers will see to your brand," Soren ordered, gesturing to a group of women waiting in the shadows. "You will be bathed. You will be fed. You will be safe." "Safe?" Rosalie found her voice. though it sounded thin and hollow to her own ears. "You dragged me from one execution to another? Why did you wait, Soren? Why did you let him break me before you stepped in?" Soren paused, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He didn't look back at her. The firelight played across his scars, making them look like silver rivers. "A wolf who has everything has no reason to leave," he said quietly. "A wolf who has nothing to lose." He walked out of the hall, leaving Rosalie alone with the flickering flames. As she looked around the dark stone room, she saw a line of scouts standing near the door. Her breath caught. She recognized the lead scout, the man with the jagged scar across his brow. He was the rogue from the spy reports. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The letters, the sightings, the treason. It hadn't been a coincidence. Soren hadn't just saved her from a tragedy. He had built the stage for it. She wasn't a mate to him. She was a prize he had stolen from the ruins of her life. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. The stone walls of the obsidian citadel didn't just hold out the wind. They seemed to swallow sound itself. Rosalie sat on the edge of a massive, fur-draped bed, her fingers trembling as they traced the jagged, unranked brand on her shoulder. The healers had applied a cooling salve, but the sting of the silver was nothing compared to the cold realization settled in her gut. Soren had been there. Not just at the execution, but in the shadows of her life for months. "You're awake," a voice rumbled from the doorway. Rosalie bolted upright, clutching the silk sheets to her chest. Soren stood framed by the arched stone entrance, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hallway. He had traded his gore-stained armor for a heavy tunic of black wool, but he still looked like a storm held in a human skin. "Why?" Rosalie whispered, her voice cracking. "The scout with the scarred brow. I saw him in your hall. He was the one Fenris found in the woods. You fed me to him. You let them strip my wolf." Soren walked into the room, his boots clicking rhythmically against the obsidian floor. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He stopped at the foot of her bed, his golden eyes tracking the pulse jumping in her neck. "Fenris was a pressure cooker, Rosalie," Soren said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "He was going to break you eventually. I simply ensured that when he did, I was the only hand reaching out to catch the pieces." "You destroyed my life to save it?" Rosalie surged to her feet, the martyr in her screaming at the injustice. "I was the beta's daughter. I had a pact. I had a purpose." "You had a cage," Soren countered, stepping closer until she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "You were a servant to a man who saw you as a breeding mare. Here, you are a queen, my queen." He reached out, his hand hovering near her marked neck. The mate bond flared, a hot, electric current that made her knees weak. It was infuriating. Her mind hated him, but her body recognized him as the other half of her soul. "Don't touch me," she hissed, though she didn't pull away. "You'll learn, Rosalie," Soren whispered, his thumb finally brushing the edge of his mark. "In the North, we don't care about ranks. We care about survival. And right now, I am the only thing keeping you alive." He turned and left, the heavy iron door thudding shut behind him. The sound was final. She was safe from the executioner's blade, but she was trapped in a fortress of ice with a man who played with lives like chess pieces. Chapter 8. The Meat Grinder. The next morning, the citadel felt less like a palace and more like a war camp. Rosalie was escorted to the great hall by 2 silent guards. The air was thick with the smell of wet fur and iron. "She's a southern weakling," a voice spat as she entered. Rosalie turned to see a group of northern commanders huddled over a massive stone table. In the center was a map of the border, littered with black and silver markers. The man who had spoken was Thane, a scarred warrior with arms the size of tree trunks. "She has no wolf," Thane continued, glaring at Rosalie. "How can an unranked female lead us? Soren is blinded by the bond." "The bond doesn't blind me, Thane. It sharpens me." Soren's voice drifted from the head of the table. He looked at Rosalie, a silent challenge in his eyes. "Tell them, Rosalie. How would Fenris move his troops through the Iron Pass?" Rosalie felt the heat of a dozen glares. Her internal flaw, the belief that she was nothing without her title, flared up, making her want to shrink away. But then she looked at the map. Her tactical empathy took over. She didn't see markers. She saw terrain, fatigue, and Fenris's predictable ego. "He wouldn't use the pass," Rosalie said, walking toward the table. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. "The pass is too narrow for his heavy infantry. He'll use the frozen creek to the east. The ice is thick enough for horses this time of year, and it cuts 3 hours off the march." The room went silent. Thane looked at the map, then back at Rosalie, his eyes narrowing. "She's lying," Thane muttered, "trying to lead us into an ambush." "Check the scouts' reports from this morning," Soren ordered. A runner scrambled into the hall minutes later, breathless. "Alpha, southern tracks found near the East Creek. At least 3 companies." Soren looked at his commanders, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "It seems my weakling mate knows your enemy better than you do." Rosalie didn't feel like a winner. She felt like a tool being calibrated. She looked at Soren, seeing the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't just using her for the bond. He was using her brain to win a war. She had a new goal: prove she was more than his weapon, even if she had to do it without her wolf. Chapter 9. The First Test. The peace of the Citadel was shattered 2 hours later. "Southern raiders at the West Gate," the alarm bells screamed, a frantic, clanging sound that echoed through the stone halls. Rosalie was rushed to the battlements. Below, a small but elite squad of Silver Moon warriors was attempting to firebomb the supply wagons. They weren't there to conquer. They were there to burn the North's winter food. "Stay back," Soren ordered, his hand gripping the hilt of his massive claymore. "This is a distraction." "Soren, wait!" Rosalie grabbed his arm. Her eyes scanned the clearing below. She saw the way the raiders were moving. They weren't aiming for the wagons. They were aiming for the oil vats near the kitchens. "If those go up, the whole lower ward burns," Soren growled, the sound vibrating through her palm. He looked at the vats, then back at the raiders. "Thane, take the left flank. I'll take the center." "No!" Rosalie shouted. "The center is a kill zone. Look at the archers in the tree line." But Soren was already moving. He vaulted over the stone railing, shifting midair. The transformation was a violent, beautiful blur of snapping bone and erupting fur. A massive black wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, slammed into the mud below. He was a force of nature, a shadow of death tearing through the southern ranks. But Rosalie saw the archers notched their bows. They weren't using wood. They were using silver-tipped bolts. "Soren, get out of there!" she screamed. She didn't have a wolf. She didn't have a rank. But she had a bow left by a guard on the wall. Rosalie grabbed it, the wood biting into her palms. She took a breath, focusing on the movement in the trees. Thwip. The first archer fell. Thwip. The second. She was a blur of efficiency, her beta training taking over. She cleared the tree line just as Soren reached the oil vats. He looked up, his golden wolf eyes locking onto hers. For a second, the chaos of the battle vanished. There was only the bond, hot, fierce, and undeniable. He finished the last raider with a snap of his jaws and shifted back, standing naked and bloodied in the mud. He looked up at Rosalie, his chest heaving. "You saved the ward," he shouted over the wind. "I saved you," Rosalie muttered to herself, her heart pounding. She had passed the first test, but the stakes had just been raised. Fenris wasn't just coming for her. He was trying to starve the North to get her back. And Soren? Soren was starting to look at her not as a prize, but as a partner. That was the most dangerous thing of all. Chapter 10. The Cold Welcome. The adrenaline from the battle at the West Gate ebbed away, leaving a hollow, biting chill in its wake. Rosalie stood on the ramparts of the obsidian citadel, her breath hitching in the sub-zero air. Below, The northern warriors were dragging the bodies of Fenris's raiders into the snow, their movements efficient and heartless. "You have the eyes of a hawk, southern girl." A rasping voice interrupted her thoughts. Rosalie turned to find Bryn, a silver-haired shield maiden with a face like cracked granite. Bryn was the Citadel's head of internal security, and she hadn't smiled since Rosalie arrived. She tossed a bundle of thick white furs at Rosalie's feet. "The king says you're to be moved to the solar," Bryn stated, her voice like grinding stones. "But don't think a few lucky shots with a bow makes you one of us. You're still a wolfless stray in a den of lions." "I'm not trying to be one of you, Bryn," Rosalie replied, pulling the furs around her shivering frame. "I'm trying to keep us all from burning. Fenris won't stop at a few wagons." "Then you'd best learn the layout of this mountain," Bryn grunted, gesturing for Rosalie to follow. "In the north, we don't just defend walls, we become them. If you can't run with the pack, you'll be trampled by it." They walked through the labyrinthine corridors of the citadel. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of pine resin and the low, constant hum of the mountain's geothermal heat. Every wolf they passed stopped to stare. Their eyes weren't full of the fawning respect she'd known as a beta's daughter. They were narrowed with a primal, predatory suspicion. "They smell the silver on you," Bryn said, not looking back. "The scent of a broken wolf is like rot to a healthy pack. It makes them restless. It makes them want to finish what your alpha started." Rosalie gripped the furs tighter, her knuckles white. She felt the unranked brand on her shoulder throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. She was a ghost in a world of monsters, a flickering candle in a hurricane of alpha power. Chapter 11. The War of Words. The solar was a circular room at the highest peak of the citadel, offering a panoramic view of the jagged, ice-covered peaks. Soren was there, standing by a roaring hearth. He looked up as Rosalie entered, his golden eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Bryn says you've been studying the fortifications," Soren said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in Rosalie's very bones. "I've been studying the gaps," Rosalie countered, walking toward the window. "Your west gate is strong, but the drainage tunnels beneath the kitchens are wide enough for a lean wolf to squeeze through. Fenris knows this. He helped design similar tunnels in the south." Soren's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine interest crossing his scarred features. He walked toward her, his presence filling the room until the air felt thick and electric. "You're thinking like a beta again, Rosalie," he murmured, stopping inches from her. "Always looking for the crack in the shield, always trying to be the one who saves everyone." "Someone has to," Rosalie snapped, her eyes flashing. "You brought me here as a trophy, Soren, but if you want to win this war, you need to stop looking at me like a prize and start listening to me like an ally." "An ally?" Soren laughed, a dark, rough sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You're my mate, Rosalie. Our souls are stitched together by the moon herself. There is no ally or enemy between us, only us." He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw. His touch was a paradox, rough and calloused, yet impossibly gentle. The mate bond flared, a sudden, violent surge of heat that made Rosalie's breath hitch. Her mind screamed manipulator, but her heart hammered a frantic, traitorous rhythm against her ribs. "Tell me," Soren whispered, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "If I give you a seat at the war table, if I give you the power to command my men, will you finally stop looking for the exit?" "I'll stop looking for the exit when I stop feeling like a prisoner," Rosalie replied, her voice a shaky defiance. Soren leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of him, snow, cedar, and raw power enveloped her, a sensory cage she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. "Then prove it," he breathed. "Prove you're a queen of the north, not just a refugee of the south." Chapter 12. The Bitter Gift. The proof came sooner than Rosalie expected. 2 days later, a southern messenger was sighted at the base of the mountain. He bore no white flag, only a blood-stained crate marked with the Ezra family seal. The great hall was silent as the crate was brought before Soren's throne. Rosalie stood beside him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She knew that seal. She knew the weight of that wood. "Open it," Soren ordered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Thane stepped forward, his massive claws catching the edge of the lid. He pried it open with a sickening screech of nails. A collective gasp rippled through the hall, followed by a heavy, suffocating silence. Inside the crate, resting on a bed of black lilies, was the severed head of Marcus, the head of Rosalie's personal guard. He had been the one who taught her to track. He had been the one who stood by her during the midnight arrest. Pinned to his forehead was a note in Fenris's elegant, cruel handwriting. "Property must be returned, or the rest will follow." Rosalie felt the world tilt. A wave of nauseating grief crashed over her, followed by a white-hot, blinding rage. She lunged forward, but Soren's arm was a bar of iron across her chest, holding her back. "Let me go!" Rosalie screamed, her voice breaking. "He was an innocent. He had nothing to do with this." "This is what he wants, Rosalie," Soren growled, his voice a command that physically pinned her to his side. "He wants you to run back to him in a fit of grief. He wants you to think the North is the reason your friends are dying." "The North is the reason!" Rosalie spat, turning on him with bared teeth. "You claimed me. You started this fire, and now my people are burning in it." Soren looked down at her, his golden eyes devoid of warmth. "Then help me put the fire out. Fenris thinks he can break you by taking what you love. Show him he's only giving you a reason to kill him." He turned to the messenger, his voice turning into the dread howl that made the very floorboards vibrate. "Go back to your alpha. Tell him the North does not return property. We only return results." Soren looked back at Rosalie, his grip on her arm tightening. "Now you see why you need my protection, Rosalie. Fenris isn't coming for a mate. He's coming for a corpse." Rosalie looked at the crate, then at the king who had saved her. She was caught between a monster who wanted to break her and a king who wanted to use her. The stakes had been raised. The war was no longer about territory, it was about her soul. Chapter 13. The Shadow in the Map Room. The grief for Marcus didn't fade. It hardened into a cold, jagged diamond in Rosalie's chest. For 3 days, she lived in the war room, her eyes tracing every supply line and guard rotation of the Silver Moon Pack. Soren gave her space, but his golden gaze followed her like a physical weight. He was waiting for her to break, or perhaps to finally belong. "You need to sleep, Rosalie," Soren rumbled, his shadow stretching across the massive oak table. "A tired mind makes tactical errors." "I'll sleep when Fenris is a memory," Rosalie snapped, her fingers ghosting over a map of the border. "He's moving. I can feel it. He's shifting his wolf breakers to the western ridge." Soren stepped closer, the scent of winter and old leather enveloping her. He placed a hand over hers, his skin hot against her chilled fingers. The mate bond hummed, a low, rhythmic vibration that felt like a purr. "My scouts report no movement there," he said softly. "Then your scouts are looking at the trees, not the shadows," Rosalie countered, pulling her hand away. "I need the primary logs, the raw data from the border outposts. Your summaries are too polished." Soren stiffened, his jaw tightening. "My commanders provide what is necessary. You are a guest here, Rosalie, a queen, not a general." "I'm a prisoner who can draw a map," she corrected, her voice dripping with acid. "If you want me to save your fortress, give me the truth." Soren stared at her for a long beat, his eyes searching hers for a weakness he could exploit. Finally, he exhaled a cloud of frost. "The archives are in the sublevel. Don't let me regret trusting you with them." He walked out, leaving the scent of cedar and a lingering sense of victory. But as Rosalie watched him go, she didn't feel like a queen. She felt like a spy. Chapter 14. The Midpoint Shift. The sublevel of the citadel was a tomb of parchment and dust. Rosalie worked by the light of a single flickering candle, her fingers stained black with ink. She wasn't looking for Fenris anymore. She was looking for the why. Why did Soren arrive at the exact second the blade was at her throat? Why did the northern scouts know her father's secret trails? She found a leather-bound ledger tucked behind a crate of old treaties. It wasn't a public record, it was a personal log. Soren's handwriting, sharp, jagged, and precise. Entry: 412, Scout 09, reports the Beta's daughter has rejected the Alpha's offer. Fenris is unstable. The opening is clear. Rosalie's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She flipped the pages, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Entry 418, planted the northern ciphers in the Ezra study. Fenris's captain took the bait. Arrest imminent. The candle flickered, casting long, monstrous shadows against the stone walls. Rosalie felt a wave of nausea so violent she had to grip the table to stay upright. Soren hadn't just watched her downfall. He had scripted it. He had sent his own men to frame her, knowing Fenris's pride would do the rest. Entry 420. Execution set for dawn. I will wait until the wolf breaking is complete. A wolfless mate is a dependent mate. She will have no choice but the north. A dependent mate, Rosalie whispered, the words tasting like copper and ash. Every touch, every protective growl, every moment of supposed salvation was a lie. He had let her be tortured. He had let her wolf be silenced. All so he could claim a broken woman who had nowhere else to run. Chapter 15. The Predator Revealed. The heavy iron door of the archive creaked open. Rosalie didn't look up. She didn't need to. The sudden drop in temperature and the electric charge in the air told her exactly who was standing there. You were always too smart for your own good, Rosalie, Soren said, his voice devoid of the warmth he had faked for weeks. Rosalie turned, the ledger clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her gaze was a blade. You let them do it. You watched them drive silver into my veins. You heard my wolf scream, and you waited. Soren walked into the room, his presence suffocating. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a king who had won a difficult campaign. Fenris would have killed you eventually, Soren said, his voice flat. I gave you a life. I gave you a throne. What does it matter how the foundation was laid? It matters because it's a lie, Rosalie screamed, throwing the ledger at his feet. You didn't save me. You conquered me. You're no better than Fenris. You just used silk instead of shackles. Soren moved so fast she didn't see him. In a heartbeat, he had her pinned against the stone wall, his hands on either side of her head. His golden eyes were blazing, the alpha power rolling off him in waves that made it hard to breathe. I am nothing like Fenris, Soren hissed, his face inches from hers. Fenris wanted to break you to hide his weakness. I broke your chains to show you your strength. You were wasting away in that pack, Rosalie. You were a lioness serving a dog. And what am I now? She spat, her heart thundering against her ribs. Your pet? Your tactical advisor? You are my mate, Soren growled, his lips brushing against hers. And despite the lies, the bond is real. You feel it. You want me as much as you hate me. He kissed her then, a violent, desperate claim that tasted of salt and rage. Rosalie tried to fight it, but the mate bond erupted like a volcano, a treacherous surge of heat that made her wrap her arms around his neck, even as she sobbed into his mouth. He pulled away, his forehead resting against hers. They were both breathing hard, the air between them thick with a toxic mix of desire and betrayal. Fenris is launching a full-scale assault at the border, Soren whispered, his voice a jagged edge. He's bringing the wolf breakers. If you want your revenge, Rosalie, you have to stay. You have to lead my army. Rosalie looked at the man who had destroyed her world to own it. She had no wolf. She had no home. She had only her rage and the monster who loved her. I'll lead your army, she whispered, her eyes turning as cold as the obsidian walls. But don't think for a second that I've forgiven you. When Fenris is dead, Soren, you're next. Chapter 16. The Pact of Cold Iron. The air in the solar was thick with the scent of burnt parchment and unspoken threats. Rosalie stood by the window, watching the moonlight dance off the frozen peaks. She didn't turn when Soren entered. She didn't have to. The mate bond was a jagged wire pulled taut between them, vibrating with every breath he took. "The border outposts are falling, Rosalie," Soren said, his voice a low, rough grate. "Fenris isn't just raiding anymore. He's executing every unranked wolf he finds. He's clearing the path for his wolf breakers." Rosalie finally turned, her eyes 2 chips of frozen flint. "And you're telling me this because you want me to feel guilty? Or because you need me to fix the mess you helped create?" Soren walked into the light, his face a mask of brutal honesty. "I'm telling you because I've reached the limit of what raw power can do. I can kill 1,000 men, but I cannot outrun a tactical genius who knows my every move. I need the beta's daughter. I need the woman who sees the battlefield before the first drop of blood hits the snow." Rosalie walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the stone. She stopped inches from his chest, feeling the heat radiating from his massive frame. "I will lead your army, Soren. I will burn Fenris's world to ash, but I will not do it as your puppet. I will not do it as a dependent mate." She reached out, her fingers tracing the heavy fur of his cloak. "You want my mind? Then you give me my body back. You help me break the silver suppression. You help me find my wolf, or I let the north fall." Soren's golden eyes flared, a predatory hunger swirling in their depths. He knew the risk. A Rosalie with her wolf restored was a Rosalie who could truly kill him. But he also knew he had no other choice. "The silver isn't just in your blood, Rosalie," Soren whispered, his hand covering hers. "It's a cage in your mind. To break it, we have to go to the brink. It will be agony. It will feel like dying all over again." "I've already died once," Rosalie countered, her voice a sharp, lethal edge. "Now, I want to live long enough to see my enemies bleed." Chapter 17. The Crucible of Bone. The training began in the obsidian vault, a room deep within the mountain where the air was thin and the walls were lined with cold iron. Soren didn't go easy on her. He couldn't. The silver in her veins was a parasite that fed on weakness. Only a violent, primal shock could jar it loose. "Again!" Soren roared, his voice a dread howl that sent a shockwave through the room. Rosalie scrambled up from the stone floor, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. She had no wolf to dull the pain, no heightened senses to predict his movements. She was just a woman against a king. Soren lunged, a blur of lethal grace. Rosalie didn't try to match his strength. She dropped low, using his momentum against him, her elbow catching him in the ribs with a sickening thud. He grunted, a flash of genuine pride crossing his face before he swept her legs out from under her. She hit the floor hard, the unranked brand on her shoulder searing with white-hot pain. "Your wolf is screaming, Rosalie!" Soren shouted, pinning her down with the weight of his body. "I can hear her! She's trapped behind a wall of silver and your own fear! Reach for her! Bite back!" "I can't," Rosalie gasped, her vision blurring. "Yes, you can." Soren's face was inches from hers, his scent, snow and raw alpha power, filling her senses. He bit into the mate bond, sending a surge of primal energy through the connection. It was a violation and a gift all at once. Rosalie felt it then, a spark in the dark. A low, vibrating growl echoed from the deepest part of her soul. It wasn't the proud beta wolf she had lost. It was something darker, something forged in the mud of the hollow and tempered in the ice of the north. Her eyes snapped open, the pupils bleeding into a dark midnight blue. She didn't shift. The silver was still too strong, but for a split second, her fingernails lengthened into jagged claws. She raked them across Soren's chest, drawing 4 thin lines of blood. Soren pulled back, a low, rumbling purr vibrating in his throat. He looked at the blood on his chest, then at the fire in Rosalie's eyes. "There she is," he whispered, the Queen of Scars. Chapter 18. The Point of No Return. The success in the vault had a price. The mate bond, once a source of suspicion, was now a roaring furnace. Every touch during their training sessions felt like a brand. Every shared glance was a promise of violence and desire. Late that night, as the wind howled outside the citadel, Soren found Rosalie in the map room. She was sharpening her silver-tipped arrows, her movements rhythmic and obsessed. "The wolf-breakers have crossed the Black River," Soren said, his voice heavy with the coming war. "Fenris is leading them himself. He's using a new weapon, a silver gas that targets the bond. He wants to sever us, Rosalie. He wants to leave you a husk." Rosalie stood, her heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat. She walked toward him, the tension between them finally snapping like a dry branch. "Let him try," she said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "He thinks he can take what's his. He doesn't realize I've already stopped being his, and I've stopped being yours." She grabbed the front of his tunic, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of iron and desperation. It wasn't an act of love. It was an act of war. She was claiming him, marking him back, proving that even without a rank, she could dominate the King of the North. Soren groaned, his hands tangling in her hair as he backed her against the map table. The maps of their kingdoms were crushed beneath them. Borders meant nothing now. There was only the heat of their skin and the frantic, primal need to belong to something before the world ended. "If we die tomorrow," Soren breathed against her neck, his teeth grazing the mark he had given her. "I want the last thing I feel to be you." "We aren't going to die," Rosalie whispered, her eyes glowing with that new dark light. "We're going to hunt." As they surrendered to the fire of the bond, the unranked brand on Rosalie's shoulder began to glow with a faint, ghostly silver light. The cage was cracking. The beta's daughter was gone, and something far more dangerous was taking her place. Chapter 19. The Silver Mist. The march toward the silver moon border was a symphony of crunching snow and clanking armor. Rosalie rode at Soren's side, her eyes scanning the tree line with a tactical intensity that made the northern commanders fall into a respectful silence. The heat from their night together still simmered beneath her skin, a secret fire against the biting wind. But the peace was a lie. "The air is too still," Rosalie whispered, her hand tightening on the hilt of her dagger. "Fenris doesn't wait. He traps." "Let him trap," Soren rumbled, his golden eyes fixed on the horizon. "My warriors are hungry for southern blood." They reached the Black River Gorge when the world turned gray. It wasn't a natural fog. It was a thick, swirling vapor that smelled of metallic rot and bitter hemlock. The horses began to scream, their eyes rolling back as the wolf-breaker gas hit their lungs. "Masks up!" Rosalie shouted, but it was too late. The gas didn't just burn the throat, it targeted the mate bond. Rosalie felt a sudden, agonizing jolt in her chest, like a hot wire being snapped in two. Beside her, Soren buckled, his massive frame shaking as he collapsed from his horse. The alpha power that usually radiated from him like a furnace was being snuffed out by the silver-laced toxin. "Soren!" Rosalie scrambled off her mount, her lungs searing as she crawled toward him. "Run! Rosalie!" Soren gasped, his veins turning a sickly, translucent black. Through the shifting mist, a line of shadows emerged. They wore masks of cold iron and carried long, silver-tipped pikes. The wolf-breakers. And in the center, walking with the casual gait of a man strolling through a garden, was Fenris. "Look at you," Fenris mocked, his voice muffled by his respirator. "The King of the North brought to his knees by a little chemistry, and my sweet traitorous Rosalie, back in the mud where she belongs." Rosalie tried to reach for her bow, but a heavy boot slammed into her hand. The world tilted as a wolf-breaker grabbed her by the hair, dragging her away from Soren's reaching, trembling hand. "Don't kill him yet," Fenris ordered, staring at the dying king. "I want him to watch while I take back what's mine. I want him to feel the bond shatter while he's still alive to mourn it." Chapter 20. The Return to the Hollow. The carriage ride back to the Silver Moon territory was a descent into a nightmare Rosalie thought she had escaped. She was shackled in heavy, silver-dampening iron, her skin blistering where the metal touched her unranked brand. Fenris sat across from her, sipping wine as if they were back at the spring gala. "You smell of him?" Fenris said, his voice dripping with a nauseating jealousy. "The North has made you coarse, Rosalie, but don't worry. The cleansing ritual will fix that. We'll burn the king out of your blood." "He'll kill you, Fenris," Rosalie spat, her voice a raspy shadow of itself. "The North doesn't forgive, and neither do I." Fenris laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "The North is a leaderless pack of dogs right now, and you're just a girl with a brand and a broken spirit." They arrived at the hollow as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the muddy clearing. It looked exactly as it had the day she was supposed to die. The same stone post. The same smell of damp earth and rot. "Tonight we finish the ceremony," Fenris announced to the gathered Silver Moon wolves. "We will scrub the northern filth from her soul. She will be the example of what happens to those who betray their alpha." They chained her to the post, the cold rain mixing with the tears of rage on her cheeks. Fenris approached with a brand glowing with a sickly, violet light, a soul scraper, designed to permanently sever a fated bond. "Where is your king now, Rosalie?" Fenris whispered, bringing the heat close to her face. "Where is the man who claimed you?" Chapter 21. The Dark Night of the Soul. The silence of the dungeon beneath the hollow was louder than any scream. Rosalie sat in the dark, her body a map of silver burns and bruises. The ritual had been interrupted by a freak mountain storm, but the damage was done. The mate bond felt quiet. For the first time since the execution, she couldn't feel Soren. "Is he dead?" she whispered into the darkness. Her internal flaw, that deep-rooted belief that she was only worth what she could provide, tore at her mind. She had failed the North. She had failed her father. She had led Soren into a trap she should have seen coming. She was just a broken wolf in a cell, waiting for the morning light to bring the final blow. "I am nothing," she sobbed, her forehead resting against the cold, weeping stone. "Just a piece of property in a war between two monsters." She reached deep into her mind, searching for that dark, flickering spark she had found in the obsidian vault. But there was only the cold, numbing silence of the silver. "Please," she begged the moon, though the sky was hidden by leagues of stone. "Don't let me die like this. Not as a victim." A small, rhythmic scratching sound caught her ear. She looked up, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Near the corner of the cell, hidden behind a loose stone, was a series of carvings. She crawled toward them, her fingers trembling. It was her father's handwriting. "For the daughter of the shield," the carving began. "The silver is a cage for the mind, but the wolf is the key. Look not for the strength of the pack, but the strength of the silence. To be unranked is to be unbound." Rosalie's breath hitched. Her father hadn't just been a beta. He had been a historian. He knew the ancient ways. The ways of the wolves who lived before the ranks were ever created. "Unbound," Rosalie repeated. She closed her eyes, ignoring the pain of the shackles. She stopped trying to pull her wolf out. Instead, she let the silence of the silver wash over her. She stopped fighting the nothingness and embraced it. If she was nothing, then she had no rank to suppress. If she was nothing, then Fenris had no command over her. In the deepest part of her soul, the darkness began to glow, not with the golden light of an alpha or the silver light of a beta. It was a midnight blue, cold and vast as the northern sky. The shackles didn't break. Not yet. But in the silence of the cell, the unranked brand on her shoulder began to pulse with a steady, defiant heartbeat. The king might be dying and the pack might be turning, but Rosalie Ezra was finally finding her own teeth. Chapter 22. The Strength of the Silence. The damp stone of the dungeon floor bit into Rosalie's skin, but she no longer felt the cold. Following her father's carved words, she went deeper into the void within herself. For years, she had defined herself by her rank, her duty, and her utility to the Alpha. Now, stripped of everything, she found the one thing Fenris couldn't touch, her own raw, unyielding will. "You aren't a rank, Rosalie," she whispered into the dark, her voice a low, steady vibration. "You are the storm." Suddenly, the unranked brand on her shoulder didn't feel like a burn. It felt like a door. She realized the silver suppression worked by targeting the channels of power used by alphas and betas. But as an outcasted, nothing wolf, she could bypass those channels entirely. She reached into the midnight blue darkness of her soul and pulled. The silver shackles hissed. A faint, ghostly blue light began to bleed from the metal, the iron groaning under a pressure it wasn't designed to contain. Rosalie's eyes snapped open, her pupils devouring the iris until they were twin pits of endless night. "I am the wolf," she breathed. With a sharp, metallic crack, the silver dampening cuffs shattered. Rosalie stood, her body aching but her spirit feeling lighter than it had in years. She didn't have the bulk of an alpha, but she had the lethal, silent grace of a ghost. She looked at the iron bars of her cell. She didn't pull them. She felt for the structural weakness in the stone. One precise kick, fueled by the cold fire in her veins, sent the hinges screaming from the wall. She stepped out into the corridor, a predator reborn in the heart of her enemy's lair. Chapter 23. The Army of the Unwanted. The lower levels of the Silver Moon dungeons were filled with the broken, wolves who had failed Fenris, rogues who had been captured, and the unranked who had been discarded like trash. Rosalie moved through the shadows, her tactical empathy allowing her to feel their collective despair. "Wake up," Rosalie whispered, stopping at the first cage. Inside was a young male, his eyes dull with the same silver sickness she had endured. "Who are you?" the boy rasped, flinching from the light of her glowing brand. "I'm the woman who's going to show you how to bite back," Rosalie said, her voice a calm, commanding force. "Fenris thinks you're broken. He thinks you're nothing, but nothing is the only thing he can't control." She moved from cell to cell, shattering locks with her newfound, silent strength. She didn't give them a speech about pack loyalty. She gave them a reason to hate. She whispered the truths she had seen in Soren's logs, how Fenris was selling their resources, how he had killed his own people to maintain his lies. "He took your rank to make you slaves," Rosalie told the growing crowd of ragged, hollow-eyed wolves. "But look at me. I have no rank, and I am free. Tonight, we don't fight for a throne. We fight for the right to exist." By the time they reached the service tunnels, Rosalie had an army of 50 nothing wolves. They were thin, scarred, and weak, but they had the desperation of the damned. "The north is at the gates," Rosalie told them, pointing toward the ceiling. "Soren is coming. If we strike from below while he hits from the front, Fenris will have nowhere to run. Are you with me?" A low, vibrating hum rose from the throats of the prisoners. Not a pack howl, but a collective snarl of vengeance. They were the shadows Fenris had ignored, and tonight, the shadows were coming for his throat. Chapter 24. The Ghost of the North. The trek through the drainage tunnels was a test of endurance, the cold water stinging Rosalie's bare feet. But as they neared the exit, a sudden, violent jolt hit her chest. It was a flare of heat, a familiar electric hum that made her breath hitch. The mate bond. It was back. Soren. She closed her eyes, sending a mental pulse through the connection. Not a plea for help, but a tactical strike. Soren. "The south gate is a decoy. He has wolf breakers in the granary. Hit the east wall. I am coming up through the floor." Miles away, at the edge of the forest, King Soren, the bone breaker. Vane skidded to a halt. His fur was matted with blood, and his chest was scarred from the silver gas. But his eyes blazed with a new, terrifying light. He had felt her. He had felt the unbound power of his mate. "She's alive," Soren roared, his voice a dread howl that shook the very trees. "And she's leading the way. Charge." Back in the tunnels, Rosalie felt the vibration of the Northern Army's approach. She looked at her group of outcasts, her midnight blue eyes glowing with a lethal resolve. "The king is here," she whispered, her claws extending, black and sharp as obsidian. But he's just the distraction. We are the blade. She kicked the heavy iron grate leading into the great hall, the metal flying upward like a leaf in a gale. Rosalie surged into the light, a blur of fur and fury, leading her army of ghosts into the heart of the Silver Moon Pack. The final push had begun. Fenris had tried to strip her rank and break her wolf, but all he had done was create the one thing that could truly destroy him. A wolf with nothing left to fear. Chapter 25. The Shattered Mirror. The Great Hall of the Silver Moon Pack didn't just break, it detonated. Rosalie exploded through the floorboards like a vengeful spirit, her army of nothing wolves pouring out behind her in a wave of ragged fur and silver-scarred skin. The air was thick with the scent of pine, old blood, and the ozone of a dying alpha's power. "Rosalie!" Fenris screamed, stumbling back from his throne. His face was a mask of aristocratic horror. You should be a husk. The silver should have eaten you whole." "The silver only ate the cage you built for me, Fenris," Rosalie said, her voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to come from the mountain itself. She didn't shift into a standard wolf. She stayed in a lethal hybrid form. Her height increased, her skin shimmering with a midnight blue sheen, and her eyes twin pits of endless winter. She was the Unbound, a glitch in the Pack's ancient laws. Around her, the broken wolves she had freed were tearing into Fenris's elite guards. It wasn't a tactical skirmish. It was a riot. The guards, trained to fight organized ranks, had no answer for the primal, chaotic fury of wolves who had already lost everything. Suddenly, the massive front doors of the hall were torn from their hinges. A blast of sub-zero wind hauled into the room, carrying the scent of snow and ancient cedar. Soren, the Bonebreaker Vane, charged through the debris. He was a mountain of black fur and scars, his golden eyes locking onto Rosalie with a desperate, predatory relief. He let out a dread howl so powerful the stone pillars groaned. "Soren!" Fenris lunged for a silver-tipped spear, his eyes wild. "I'll kill her! I'll kill her before you can have her." Chapter 26. The Climax in the Mud. The fight spilled out of the hall and back into the mud of the hollow. It was a poetic, brutal return to the site of her shaming. The rain was a torrential downpour, washing the blood from the gray earth as fast as it was spilled. Soren slammed into Fenris's flank, the two alphas becoming a blur of snapping jaws and heavy muscle. But the Wolfbreaker gas had left Soren weakened. His movements were heavy, his breath rattling in his chest. Fenris, fueled by a narcissistic frenzy, was gaining the upper hand, his silver-tipped claws carving deep furrows into Soren's throat. "Stay back, Rosalie!" Soren roared, his voice thick with blood. "This is alpha business." "No," Rosalie said, stepping into the center of the clearing. The rain seemed to curve around her, driven by the sheer pressure of her presence. "This is my business." She moved faster than either alpha could track. She was a shadow between the raindrops. She didn't use brute force. She used the tactical empathy she had honed her entire life. She saw the tremor in Fenris's left leg. She saw the way his ego made him overextend every strike. She intercepted Fenris's next lunge, her obsidian claws catching his wrists. The silver in his blood hissed as it touched her skin, but it didn't burn her, it fueled her. "You took my rank," Rosalie whispered, leaning in until her midnight eyes were all he could see. "You took my father. You took my wolf." She twisted his arms, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the clearing. "But you forgot one thing, Fenris," she growled, her voice a chorus of the 50 voices she had freed from the basement. "A shield doesn't just block, it strikes back." She drove her hand into his chest, not to take his heart, but to take his power. She reached for the alpha spark within him and snuffed it out with the cold, vast silence of her own soul. Fenris collapsed into the mud, not dead, but worse. He was human. He was unranked. He was nothing. Chapter 27. The New Equilibrium. The silence that followed was absolute. The Silver Moon warriors dropped their weapons. The northern wolves stopped their charge. Everyone looked at the woman standing over the broken remains of a tyrant. Soren shifted back to his human form, his chest heaving, his body covered in silver-laced wounds. He walked toward Rosalie, his hands shaking. He looked at her, not as a prize, not as a mate to be protected, but with a terrifying, profound respect. "Rosalie," he breathed, reaching out. She turned to him, the midnight blue light in her eyes slowly receding. She looked at his hand, then at his face. The mate bond was a roaring fire between them, but the debt of blood still lingered in the air. "You're a king, Soren," Rosalie said, her voice steady, "and I'm a woman who just learned how to kill kings. If you ever try to script my life again, if you ever try to make me dependent—" "I won't," Soren promised, his voice a raw, honest rasp. The North doesn't need a consort. We need a sovereign. I don't want a mate who follows me. I want the wolf who leads the storm." Rosalie looked around at the two packs. They were no longer enemies. They were survivors. She looked at the unranked wolves who stood behind her, their heads held high for the first time in their lives. "There will be no more unranked," Rosalie announced, her voice carrying across the valley. "There will be no more wolf breakers. We are one pack, defined not by our ranks, but by our scars." She took Soren's hand, not as an act of submission, but as a treaty. 6 months later. The obsidian citadel was no longer a silent tomb of ice. It was alive with the sound of children playing and the rhythmic beat of a rebuilding nation. The unranked brand on Rosalie's shoulder had been covered by a stunning tattoo of a wolf made of stars and midnight. Rosalie stood on the battlements, watching the sunset paint the snow in shades of gold and violet. She felt a presence behind her, the heavy, warm scent of cedar and snow. Soren wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. His heart beat against her back, a steady, grounding rhythm. "The southern envoys have arrived," Soren whispered. "They want to discuss the new trade routes." "Let them wait," Rosalie smiled, leaning back into his strength. "I'm busy." "Doing what?" She looked up at the moon, which was just beginning to rise over the peaks. She could feel her wolf, the dark, beautiful, unbound spirit, stretching within her. She wasn't a beta's daughter anymore. She wasn't a marked property. "I'm listening to the silence," she said. "It's the loudest thing I've ever heard." Soren kissed her marked neck, a gesture of pure, unadulterated love. They had been forged in betrayal and tempered in blood, but as they looked out over their united kingdom, they knew the truth. Their scars weren't signs of what they had lost. They were the map of everything they had become. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the journey of Rosalie and Soren. Their story may have ended, but yours is just beginning. Subscribe now to join the pack and stay updated on my latest werewolf romance releases. I'm Grace Cruz, and I'll see you in the next story.